Bache, we're live.
To a place you do not know. Love, on your journey I will bless you, and you shall be a blessing. You shall be a blessing. You shall be a blessing. Welcome everyone to Abraham's Table, Long Island. We are here to share with you our thoughts about our forefather, Abraham. We are a grassroots group of very nice people, I should say, who gather periodically with one vision in mind, with one sentence in mind, come together and listen. We are coming every few weeks, every month or so, and we speak about how we can learn more about each other and work together to further our mission. This is actually our 5th anniversary, believe it or not. It's been 5 years since we've been envisioning and working for that purpose. I asked to open today and welcome you because Abraham, the namesake, and what it means to me is important to share. So from my personal, non-theological place, I'm bringing my thoughts to you. So as you can understand, I was born in that place that Abraham went forward to, as he was or asked or commanded by God to go forward. And I also stepped forward. I left behind what I had there with my little suitcase, and I also walked forward. I left behind and created anew. So when we leave something behind, we should always remember where we came from and where we're going forward. And as a personal family tradition, the name Abraham goes back in our family for generations and then generations. As we check our family tree, there's always an Abraham in the background. My great-grandfather, my husband's grandfather, great-grandfather, as well as his father, were named Abraham. So when our son was born, we saw another big Abraham coming our way, and we called him as well Abraham. Abraham had this vision of spirituality and entrepreneurship. When I talk about Abraham to children, I tell them he and Sarah had the first PR company, because on their tent, if they had neon lights, they would say, "Come to our tent." So my Abraham is an entrepreneur as well, and with spirituality and ingenuity walks forward, and we shall all walk forward. And welcome to Abraham's Table, and Steve Steinig will present our speakers and open up the evening. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Nice.
Steve.
Batsheva, thank you for that welcome and those personal remarks. I welcome our entire audience to the panel on who is Abraham and what does he mean to your faith. I will start by introducing our 4 panelists in alphabetical order. First, Bishop Paul Eggensteiner. In 2019, after 35 years as the pastor in 2 churches in the metropolitan area, the bishop was elected to a 6-year term as bishop. That's when he became Bishop Eggensteiner, of the Metropolitan New York Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. The bishop finds joy and purpose in caring for all of God's people in a collaborative way, and to that end, he has been highly active in ecumenical relationships. Second is Rabbi Sheila Galaboy. She is a rabbi and social worker. After spending 15 years as a congregational rabbi, she shifted gears and obtained a master's degree in social work from Adelphi. Rabbi Galaboy combines both her rabbinic and counseling callings in her work at the Suffolk Y Jewish Community Center. Our third panelist is Dr. Tom Petriano. He is a professor of religious studies and chair of the Religious Studies Department at St. Joseph's College. He teaches courses in world religions there and a course on the religions of Abraham. He has had a long interest and commitment to interfaith dialogue. And in the cleanup spot, the fourth spot, Mr. Hakan Yesilova, who is the editor of The Fountain magazine, which bi-monthly publishes diverse articles on the humanities, religion, and civil society, including such subjects as media ethics, education, combating extremism, and intercultural dialogue. His writing focuses on Islam and Islamic civilization. I want to assure all of you in the audience that our speakers are far more distinguished and have far more accomplishments, but we only allow 2 sentences per person in these introductions. The panel discussion will go on for 45 minutes to an hour, after which there will be time for audience questions. If we were doing this program live and you had a question on something you heard, you would then have to remember it till the end of the session. So here's one advantage of this being a virtual panel. If you have a question, you can ask it immediately in the chat box, and it will be held there until the panel is finished. We reserve 45 minutes to an hour at the end for your questions, and we'll answer as many as we have time for. In the first part of our panel presentations, the principal participants will be what I refer to as the faith participants, the bishop, the rabbi, and the editor, each talking about primarily the perspective of their faith. Professor Petriano will be in the spotlight in the final 15 minutes or so of the program, where he will kind of sum up what he's heard and his perspective on what he teaches, the Abrahamic religions. So with that, I think we're ready to start. Here's the first question. Islam, Christianity, and Judaism are known as the 3 Abrahamic faiths. And Abraham is regarded as the patriarch of all 3 faiths. Who is Abraham? What does he mean to your faith? In what way was he the patriarch? Is there a genealogical and biological aspect to his being the patriarch? Or is this only a spiritual connection? I'd like to start in alphabetical order with Bishop Eggensteiner.
Thank you, Steve. One of the activities I enjoyed most was my ability to be a teacher to various lay people in our congregations. And I was the Bible guy. So I got to teach Hebrew scripture and New Testament. And when I would talk to the students in the first class about Genesis, one of the diagrams that I had seen that I shared with them was this idea that at the very beginning, God has intimate relationship with all of humanity, which consists of Adam and Eve. And as you go through the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you see that relationship continues to crumble and get more and more distant until we come to Genesis 11, where at the Tower of Babel, it seems like nobody's interested in a relationship with God at all. And that puts God in the position of starting all over again to establish a relationship with humanity that in our understanding begins with Abraham and Sarah and expands out from there. So Abraham has this absolutely pivotal kind of place in our understanding of the faith where God says, okay, I'm going to give this another shot, right? I'm committed to humanity. But now I have to get my name out there because everybody's forgotten it. So I'm going to work with Abraham. So he has that very crucial place in the history of faith. The other thing I would say about Abraham, just briefly, is that in terms of the impact that he has and the genealogical aspect, that's especially true for me as a Lutheran Christian, because as we'll hear probably many times today, what makes Abraham, one of the characteristics that makes Abraham stand out is that God approaches him and says to him, Abraham, I want you to go. And we don't have any answer of Abraham's recorded other than his action. He goes. And this becomes critical in Paul's understanding of the faith, especially in the New Testament book of Romans, where he says what distinguishes Abraham is that he was righteous because he said yes. He didn't even say yes to God, but in his action, he said yes to God. And then because Martin Luther was Augustinian and they had a great deal of value for St. Paul's writings, Luther picks up on this theme in Abraham's life as well and says that what's most important for us is that our relationship with God is a saying yes to God, because God always makes the first step. And then we are gifted with the ability to respond. And Abraham becomes one of the examples par excellence of that in the human lineage. So I would say that those two things make Abraham stand out for us as Christians, and especially as Lutheran Christians.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Rabbi Galaboy?
Sorry. Abraham was absolutely, the patriarch. He's seen as a patriarch, and it is where we moved from like a universalist perspective in the biblical writing to a more particularist. So Adam and Eve are a story that has lessons, Noah, and then the Tower of Babel. It's as if God tried a few times to get people to kind of move in the way of a faith that God wanted. And Adam and Eve, one rule: don't eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And they couldn't hold it, right? Noah, we were told he was righteous for his times, which is all relative. But even then, after there were descendants from Noah, after the great flood, we see that they, as the bishop said, they built the Tower of Babel. And once again, they were trying to reach to the skies and not concern themselves with earthly endeavors. So Abraham is that person who somehow, and there's a lot of discussion, post-biblical about it, who somehow was receptive to the call. We don't know the response. There's similarity in here. We don't know the exact response of why, but he moved. He started going on this journey, this Lech Lecha, as Batsheva played the music for. And because of that journey and the different dimensions of the journey, he became he solidified his role as the patriarch of Judaism. And the only other piece I'd say is that, is it genealogical? It's interesting because we trace our faith through those who followed the belief system that were described in the Hebrew scripture or the Old Testament, meaning that Isaac is part of the lineage, but Ishmael really isn't. Same with Jacob and Esau a couple of generations later. So who was Abraham to us? He was our patriarch. He was almost self-chosen, or at least receptive, the one who was receptive. And it becomes there's the term the chosen people, but it becomes a people who selected to be part of this tradition as the beginning.
Thank you. Mr. Yesilova?
Well, thank you. Abraham is surely one of those individuals who is mentioned many times in the Holy Quran. Actually, the greatest story in the Quran is of Moses. The longest sections of the Quran are actually reserved for Moses, but is probably followed by Abraham. And I don't know if patriarch is really the right word to use here, but he's surely the strongest, one of the strongest names to represent the faith of a monotheistic belief in God. In a similar way, the Prophet Muhammad tried to teach his community. So this makes him one of the surely most significant persons in the Islamic history. Islamic history, just to clarify myself, for us, for Muslims, Islam, of course, was the name given to the religion in the way Prophet Muhammad taught in the 7th century, but the core of his faith did not start with him, which we believe actually started with Adam. And it was the same faith that was taught throughout the human history. So what Prophet Muhammad did was actually to reintroduce it to those of us who had forgotten him. So Abraham is considered among the 5 top persons in all that Tawheed faith as we understand it, that faith in one God, including Moses, Jesus, Abraham, Noah, and Muhammad. These are the 5 top heroes of all human history, and Abraham is surely one of those 5 persons. Of course, Prophet Muhammad says, he was, let me say, all right, I am the prayer of my father Abraham, and the glad tidings of Jesus, son of Mary. So surely Prophet Muhammad makes this connection to the teachings of Abraham. And of course, genealogically, we believe Arabs descended from Ishmael. And of course, Muhammad was, peace be upon him, was a descendant of that family too. So for that matter, Abraham is surely a patriarch. Whether you accepted him genealogically, which for Islam, well, it's not probably, I wouldn't consider it a very big deal. For everyone in the eyes of God, in the Islamic perspective, are equal. But of course, based on the mission he taught the humanity, is a patriarch.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a second question, but after the second question, I'm going to ask if you start talking among yourselves as to what you've heard from one another, and it's obvious there's a lot of agreement already, but there are also points of different perspective. So this next question is, what is the most important lesson that your faith learns from Abraham's life? I'm asking you to restrict your answer to the single most important lesson, and then we'll have this discussion among you about that and your answers to the first question as well. So this time we're going to go in reverse alphabetical order, and we'll start with Mr. Yesilova.
Well, I know your third question, so I will not use that concept as I will use it in your third question. But of course, the Arabic word for the faith in one God in Islam is Tawheed, and Abraham was, of course, in addition to Muhammad and all others, was probably the strongest to voice or to bring that up into the agenda of human history once again. Believe in one God, for he lived in this time where people believed in the idols, and they had submitted themselves into instruments who could not be gods, actually, were no way worthy of worship. So Abraham, for that matter, actually reminded us of the fact that true faith really relies on one true God, but no other created things. So for that matter, what we learn from the story of Abraham is that strong faith in God, and that is certainly related to how we understand submission, which I will explain later in your third question. But Abraham actually reminded us of the fact that true faith is in no way could be indirect, but through direct connection from the person, from the human servant to the divine Lord. I think you're muted, Steve. We don't hear you. Mhm.
Rabbi Galaboy, do you want to talk about the most important lesson?
Well, to me, the most important lesson, and you know, this is debatable among our people. We don't have a single, but to me, the most important lesson is this idea of justice, and as part of it, the power to bring justice, teachings of justice, to make other people practice it as well. So if you recall, for those of you who are familiar, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, before that actually happens, Abraham is informed of God's plan because God says he singled Abraham out that he may instruct his children and his posterity to keep the way of the eternal by doing what is just and right. And that's a really great phrase. The idea of justice is a big one, and it seems almost tantamount to faith itself. So what we learn is that when Abraham challenges God, you know, would you destroy the entire city for the sake of 50, of 40, of 30? You know, he's not asking, will you save the innocent? You know, he's asking, will you save the city so that the innocent, and Abraham, of course, can save the others? So those who are wrong in their ways, those who are definitely not in the innocent, but in the guilty group as categorized in the Bible, there's hope for them. And the idea isn't to wipe them all out, unlike just the generation of Noah. The idea is that there's hope for them, and that Abraham, in arguing with God, another big lesson, but in arguing with God and challenging God, is saying, would you wipe out the whole city if there were some innocent, because we think people can be swayed, because we can probably, or we have a chance to turn their ways around. And I guess that's part of the lesson, is that, like we teach our children, it's not that people are bad, it's that their actions or their decisions are bad. So again, everyone's redeemable.
Thank you. Bishop, your turn.
Thank you, Steve. I would say that the single most important quality is both Abraham's and God's, and that is the persistence of this relationship. In my response to the first question, I mentioned the sort of deterioration of the relationship with God. So God decides to start over and calls Abraham. We know in our own personal histories and in the history of humanity that God has had to do that over and over and over again. It'd be nice if God made that decision with Abraham and everything went great, but we know that that didn't happen. And what the rabbi mentions about the persistent injustice that we experience, God keeps calling to us, and all we have to do, which sounds easy when I put it that way, all we have to do is say yes to God. Again, sounds easy, but Abraham doesn't ask for credentials, doesn't ask, as Moses does later on, for a name. According to the narrative, he just goes. And that becomes so critical as God continues to reach out to us over and over again, that our opportunity is to say, I don't know where we're going. I don't know how this is going to work. And we might talk a little bit more about that relative to Abraham going forward. But that initial reaction, which is to just say, okay, to just put that relationship into action, which in our Christian understanding is also, ironically, an activity of God who gives us the ability then to say yes to God. So even when I say yes to God, it's not me saying yes to God in a sense, it's God prodding me to say yes, like on a test where the teacher says, the right answer to number 2 is true. God says, I'm inviting you into a relationship with me, and the right answer to that is to say yes. And Abraham becomes an example of what that means for us.
I said I was going to throw it open for general discussion after the second question, but I'm going to hold off a moment because Hakan made a reference to my third question, which I thought might be part of the answer on the second question side. So let me just get that out there. And this is a question specifically for Hakan, and then we can have this broader discussion. And the question is, hey, Khan, that I know Islam considers the concept of submission as central to Abraham's life and to all of Islam. So would you talk about this, and then we'll get, we've already had some glimmers of the thinking of the bishop and the rabbi, but then we'll have a broader discussion, and we'll invite Dr. Petriano to participate, and once we get going on that.
Well, thank you, Steve. I think all our faith traditions agree on how Abraham approaches submission to God. It's specifically important in Islam, for Islam as a word doesn't only mean peace, but it also means etymologically to submit to God's will. And we believe true peace comes when you become no slave to any other thing, but become submitted, a servant to God's will only. This is true freedom when you free yourself from all other submissions and submit to the true will of God. And this comes really at a challenge when there are certain things that doesn't really make sense to our, especially very secular mindsets these days, like sacrificing your son, or taking your wife and child to the middle of a desert where there's no human settlement, no water, no food, right? These make no sense. So, but we know throughout, after how he did, that a history has emerged after what he did. And we could see in the story of Hagar, especially when she was so, in a way, panicked to have been left behind in the desert. And Abraham just goes back without saying a word. And Hagar basically asks, is this from God? And Abraham says, this is it, yes. And Hagar submits as well. Now we have the fountain in Holy Mecca, in the heart of Mecca. That's how the civilization flourished from there. I don't know if you want to see the images of Mecca, maybe later. But again, this is why Abraham's understanding of submission is the core element of Islam's understanding of faith to God.
Hey, Sheila, or any of you, any comments on what you've heard so far?
Looking at the bishop here. You look like you're about to say something. Go ahead.
Thanks. I just, and I hope I don't derail our conversation, but I think it's also important to talk about the humanity of Abraham. And in our reading of the story, God makes this approach to Abraham, makes certain promises, right, which we summarize as I'm going to give you land, I'm going to give you descendants, and through you, all people of the earth will be blessed. And I don't want us to create this image of Abraham that then separates him so much from us that we can't identify with him. Because in the very same chapter of Genesis where God makes these promises to Abraham and Abraham goes, I mean, my humble understanding of the story is that God is going to fulfill that promise of descendants through Sarah as I read the story. In that very same chapter, Abraham and Sarah are now in Egypt. And Steve, if I'm jumping too far ahead, just give me the tea, because I'll cut myself off.
No,
right
I hope you all jump and leap.
Thanks. In that very same chapter, Abraham and Sarah, who happens to be very beautiful according to the text, are in Egypt. And Abraham is thinking to himself, boy, if the Pharaoh sees her, he's going to want to get her husband out of the way, namely me, and take her to be his wife. So we're gonna fudge it a little bit, and she's going to say she's my sister, which, if you think about how that might go, Abraham loses Sarah to the Pharaoh, and God's promise to create this huge nation could be short-circuited right there. So from the initial response of Abraham to a little bit later where he says, I'm not so sure about this, is kind of typical in my experience of my relationship with God too, where some days I'm like, yes, God, whatever you want, I'm there 100%. And then when it gets really stressful, I'm thinking, are you sure this is what you want me to do? And I can so identify with Abraham when he starts to kind of think, I might need to take a little bit more of a hand in this than I originally intended. So I love his humanity as well as his deep faithfulness.
Any other comments?
Well, I think just on that point, it seems like really throughout the scriptures, the stories of the patriarchs and early prophets, God works despite our human failings. God, as the saying goes, right straight with crooked lines. And it's important. I think it's such a great point. It's important to be mindful of the humanity of Abraham, and in a way that makes us able to identify with him more, for sure.
I think it's a very important point the bishop raised, that all the prophets were, they were human beings. And in our tradition, actually, Abraham considers his behavior vis-a-vis the Pharaoh as a lapse, as he was not truly honest. So when people approach him in the hereafter, that's how the story goes. He says, look, go to another person. I cannot intervene, for I had lapsed. I had this little thing down there. So I was not. But of course, the way God, as Professor Patriano just said, God works things out, as he ended up having Hagar from Egypt. And from the Muslim tradition point of view, we had Prophet Muhammad from that line. So that was surely, from our perspective again, a wisdom that they had that journey to Egypt.
Can I add? I would just add that, it's also, if we were to look, more closely at the text, if we had the time, it's also Abraham is asking Sarah to lie, and is lying to save his own skin. In the text, it's not to save Sarah, right? Either way, Sarah has the risk of Sarah ending up, with the leader, in the Pharaoh's court. And here, it's Abraham who's saving his skin, and we don't know what's going to happen to Sarah. And the rabbinic commentators, we have our Hebrew scripture, and then we have 2,000 years of rabbinic teachings, our rabbinic sages, we call them, and some are real legal teachings, some are more exegesis, just stories that explain some of this. And they'll say, you know what, Abraham knew that he had to do it this way because Sarah would not have been happy. Sarah would not have been comfortable, if Abraham just decided he would risk his own life and he were killed so Sarah could be taken as someone else's wife. He knew she would not really be happy. So he was coming up with a temporary fix, and he had faith that everything was going to come back together. So on the one hand, things do come back together, thank you to God, in ways that we can't imagine. This message of Lech Lecha, go forth, there's no way we could imagine how the story would turn out by what we knew of Abraham and Sarah, which was very little at that point. So there's some trust that faith will carry the day. But then the fact that the intervention is, you're not just waiting passively, but the intervention, Abraham's creating this lie, is potentially derailing the whole prophecy, so to speak, God's whole promise, and in a way that is not necessarily good for everybody. Or it's interesting to have that juxtaposition of, yes, we have faith, but we're absolutely powered by free will as well. Abraham, I don't believe, and a lot of Jews don't believe that was part of God's plan. That even the derailment was part of coming back even closer to God, the repentance, the returning. We have to see that there are problematic texts, and that Abraham was fallible, and he was not necessarily, as much as he was justice oriented and held of high esteem for many reasons, we could question any of his individual choices that we know of as, are they the most righteous or the most fair or the most unselfish or giving? If those are the values we uphold with him, we look for in him, you know, we can ask all those questions because it's not always so clear and it's not always so straightforward.
Okay, let me go on. Thank you for that discussion. I'd like to hear about your personal favorite episode of Abraham's life. We've heard bits and pieces throughout as we've talked about some of these broader subjects, but now I'd like to know your favorite story. It's not necessarily, this is your personal favorite, not necessarily the incident or story that's most important within your faith, but if you'll tell us the story and why you like it so much. Rabbi, we haven't started with you on any of the rounds, so why don't we start with you and then we'll figure it out from there.
Okay, and of course I have a couple, but I'm gonna go to the less problematic one, so to speak, and that's this message of Lech Lecha. I just love this passage, and I think I love it for all of the potential of interpretation on so many levels. So Lech Lecha, this is where go forth, you know, you should go forth, but it also can be translated as go for yourself. So if you go for yourself, it's not, I'm not saying it's a selfish act. It's like, this is for your own growth. And this separation from everything you know is your personal journey and your, you know, as we say in psychology, you know, your individuation, you're leaving your father's home, you know, the home that you are, the place where you were raised, where you're comfortable, where you're known. And the truth is, you're going from your native land, that's everything you know culturally. It says from your father's house, that's everything you've known familiarly, yes. And to the place that God will show him. So he doesn't know where this journey is going to take him being Abraham, at all. And it's like the opportunity is like, the potential is, it's pregnant with opportunity. And, you know, it goes a little further in that. I'll skip the whole parsing word by word, but then it says that Abraham takes his nephew Lot, and he takes Sarah, his wife Sarah, and he takes all the people that they have acquired. But you can also translate as souls they have acquired. And it's not some Halloween thing. It's these people that somehow they have had an influence over, right? So we refer to these as the first, you know, maybe unofficial adherents. So that's really how the Israelite people came to be at that point in time. It wasn't just a line of Abraham's descendants, but it was all these people they had acquired. And so he's started to build a community. He has people who we assume are compatible thinkers, or, you know, in the area, people who are part of this community or part of this idea of, these clearly were not the people who were practicing polytheism, but it's all these souls that he's creating and he's taking. And so again, it's just that this is pure potential in theological and in historical ways. And how it turns out, we have no clue. It's beyond any human imagination how this will turn out, you know, 50 years later or 1500 years later. So that's one of the reasons I love that beginning of Abraham's story. Thank
you. It's also the very first story. I mean, it's the very beginning of Abraham being introduced.
Oh, yes.
In the Bible.
Yeah, it's the beginning of that particularism, right? I mean, we might all be descendants of Adam and Eve, but that's a problematic legacy, and it's nothing specific. It doesn't say much besides we're humans. And descendants of Noah, which we are, you know, but it still doesn't really tell us much about character. And here we have Abraham, the character, the values, And that's the beginning for us. So absolutely.
Thank you. Bishop, you look like you have a story in mind.
Thank you, Steve. Like the good rabbi, it's hard to choose. There are so many good stories about Abraham, but in preparation for today, the one I settled on is a little bit further on in their relationship between God and Abraham. God reiterates the promise to Abraham and says, don't call Sarai anymore, call her Sarah, because I'm going to give you a son by her. And Abraham's response is to fall on his face and laugh and say to himself, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham says to God, oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. This is from our Bible. And I love that story for two reasons in particular. You can interpret Abraham's laughter. It's either a laughter of disbelief, like, and it seems to be that, right? He says, I'm 100, Sarah's 90, this isn't going to happen. And God, let me teach you a little biology. But it could be a laughter of unexpected joy. Like, okay, God, you've done some pretty wild stuff already. I'm not sure how to react to this. I'm not sure if I believe you, but if this could happen, this would be absolutely awesome. And by the way, I'm not sure. I already got Ishmael. If you want to start with what I've got, that works for me rather than taking a risk. But see how Abraham learns to take a risk with God and maybe laughs at the delight of that relationship. The other thing I like about this story is that later on, when God makes that same announcement and Sarah is listening behind the tent flap, she gets chastised for laughing at God. Abraham doesn't get chastised. God just seems to accept it. But Sarah gets chastised for that. And I think, well, that's not fair. But Abraham gets away with it. So it's kind of a fun story about our human reaction to what God might be up to in our lives.
And then doesn't Isaac's name translate from Hebrew something about laughter, right? The very name.
Yeah.
Mr. Yesilova?
Right. There are multiple stories within the story of Abraham from the Islamic perspective too. I love how the rabbi and bishop, their stories were wonderful too. But the one I like most and perhaps more relevant to my concept of submission is when he was being thrown into fire with the catapult. It's not mentioned in the Holy Quran, but it's in the Islamic tradition that as he was in the catapult, an angel, probably Angel Gabriel, as in our tradition, it's the one who approaches the prophets. The angel comes, and if he asks if he needs anything at that moment, and Abraham doesn't want him. He just says, just go away. For he has this, he wants this perfect direct connection to God Almighty. This is why he is the symbol of perfect submission. He doesn't even want the intervention of angel there. For he knows he's in the trustable, reliable hands of the most powerful God, right? So he says, I'm confident. God will protect you. And in fact, there's this verse which comes, we ordered the fire to be cool and peaceful, bardan and salame, right? Bardan salame, which means, all right, the fire could have been something cool, but we know ice could be burning too. So ice and coolness could be harmful. So God doesn't only say be cool to the fire, but he also says be peaceful for Abraham. So I love that part when he really, he symbolizes in a way the superiority of the human being even beyond angels. That we have that capacity to go beyond angels and have that direct interrelationship with God Almighty. So I could perhaps share my screen here where we believe, or that's how the tradition goes, the city of Urfa. Let me share this video. I don't know if you can see it.
Yes.
This is a lake in the city of Urfa in the southeast of Turkey, where it is believed Abraham had this incident of being thrown into fire. So God turned that fireplace into a lake, and the logs of wood into the fish. That's how the story goes. And it's a pilgrimage site for many Muslims. So for that matter, I love that story way above the others.
Thank you. One of the most prominent stories of Abraham, one of the most biblical portions about Abraham, of which we've said very little so far, and I'd like a more somber episode in his life is sacrificing his son, or being willing to sacrifice his son. So I'd like to just bring that up, and Bishop Eggenstein mentioned some different interpretations of Abraham's laughter. Throughout the Bible, many stories have multiple and contrasting interpretations, and certainly this episode. So why don't we start with the rabbi, and then I'll ask the bishop to address this, and then Mr. Yesikova as well. Rabbi?
Address the whole story?
Well, and the highlights of the story, but particularly then the interpretation. How does this reflect on Abraham's faith, Abraham's qualities as a person, all the things we've been talking about in the episodes with the Pharaoh? The same kinds of interpretations are possible.
You know, I feel it's a bit of a game of chicken. It's, it's biblical playing chicken. And one of the reasons is that, first of all, the very beginning of the chapter says, and it came about that God put Abraham to the test. So Abraham might not have known he was being put to the test, but we are told that in the very beginning. And I think part of it is to let us know that this isn't really going to happen. What seems like the initial request, sacrifice your son, we know this is a test. So right away kind of takes some of the pressure off. Having said that, then then Abraham still gets a little bit playful. So the question is, so the two questions seem to be between the different faiths and even different interpretations within faiths. How do we know in our faith it's Isaac, or was it Isaac or Ishmael? And secondly, does he actually get sacrificed, right? So first of all, it says, God is telling Abraham to take your son, your favored one, whom you love, Isaac. So in the Midrash, that later rabbinical, elaboration written by the rabbis, take your son. And it says in the Midrash, which son? I have two sons, right? Your favored one. How can I favor one son over the other? Whom you love. But I love both my sons, right? And then finally, God has to say, it's Isaac. It's Isaac. And I actually went back because one of the translations I saw did the questions in a different order, but that's the order in the Hebrew. And so basically right away, Abraham is playing coy or even if we wonder what role Ishmael had after he was exiled and everything, Abraham still has two sons he loves. And so, the question, is Isaac the firstborn? Absolutely not, right? Hagar, her status changes. At first she's like, this is a tradition that the wife can hand you her concubine to have a son in her place almost. And those sons, a few generations, think about Jacob, those sons have good standing. They have legal standing. Here, all of a sudden, Hagar becomes referred to as the slave woman, and Ishmael is ousted. So it's not the firstborn here of Abraham, but it's not the favored one. It's not even the only one you love. It's Isaac. And again, this is where Judaism follows that lineage down through the generations. We don't follow the lineage through Ishmael. Ishmael is certainly acknowledged as a son of Abraham, but not as part of the Israelite Jewish lineage. So, so there's definitely a reason for it. But the question, everything that's up for interpretation, kind of softens the blow, so to speak, that we can see this as a test, we can see this as a challenge, even when Abraham is asked by Isaac, I see all the materials, but where is the animal, the ram for the sacrifice? And Abraham says, God will see to the ram, my son, or God will see to the offering, my son. It can be read two ways. God will see to the offering. I know there's going to be a ram up there in the thicket, or God is seeing to the offering because it could potentially be my son. But again, it's kind of a big challenge and a little bit of a game back and forth between human and deity.
Which is Egan Steiner, what would you like to add? And I'm going to add something specific to the question, given the things you've said about God's relationship to Abraham. Rabbi Goloboy began by saying the text says this is a test. Why was a test necessary at this point? They've been through a lot. God and Abraham have been through a lot when we get to the story of the sacrifice. Why would the test have been necessary, and what does it tell us about Abraham in terms of the actions that follow?
Thank you for that additional, Steve. It's a story it's an incident in Abraham's life that is very important for us as Christians, but in and of itself, it's such a critical story. And as Dr. Petriano said before, God draws straight with broken lines, with crooked lines. There's a song by Rascal Flatts that I really love called God Bless the Broken Road That Brought Me Straight to You, which is just a great phrase, right? And I've looked at this story of Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac as we understand it in the Christian faith to say that Abraham and God have had this developing relationship, but always that relationship hinged from the very beginning on offspring, right? A great nation, land for that great nation of people to inhabit, and then the dissemination of the blessing, which is a relationship with God that has to go on through generations. And if it at this point, in a sense, Ishmael is out of the picture or on the side. He doesn't have a prominent place. As the rabbi said, God specifies, I'm talking about Isaac here. The question that is so inspiring and difficult is, okay, Abraham, now that you've got what you wanted, what I promised you, a son, are you still going to trust me? Or are you going to be like, okay, thanks God, got what I wanted, we're all good, and then turn your back on me? Or are you going to continue to trust me and engage in that relationship? And what I find so fascinating about this story is that God calls to Abraham, says, I want you to sacrifice Isaac. And look what he does. He doesn't say, what do you want me to do that for? Again, it's almost like we're back in Genesis 12. He takes Isaac and other people, etc., and he just goes. And I don't know what's going on in Abraham's heart and mind as he makes that journey with his son. I don't know if he feels confident that God will provide an alternative sacrifice. I don't know if he's thinking, okay, so God gave us a child when I was 100 and Sarah was 90, so God can do it again, even though we're a little more advanced in age. I don't know, but what we know again is that at least one way to read this incident is that he trusts God. He says, okay, you gave me two sons, you can give me a third son if I lose this one, or you'll find another way. But it's thrusting Abraham back into that relationship where once again he's called upon to trust God. And by his action, it seems like this broken road continues, but he's at the place where he's straight in harmony with God's will, and again doesn't question, because he's learned so much about how critical that relationship is for his own self-understanding and ability to have life, right? God matters more than anything else. So that's what I would offer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Yesilova?
Right. Of course, that's one of the major parts of the Abrahamic story in all of our traditions. But in our case, the name of the son is not mentioned in the Holy Quran. And usually the Quranic interpreters say when specifics are not given in the Holy Quran, it means there's a higher meaning that you really need to focus as opposed to the details. So for Muslims, both Isaac and Ishmael are holy prophets. Even there is a verse in the Holy Quran where Abraham and Isaac are praised, like in this one. And remember our servants, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, endowed with power and insight. We made them perfectly pure and sincere by virtue of a characteristic most pure. They're constant remembers of the abode. They are in our sight among the perfectly purified, chosen ones, the truly good. So Isaac is as holy for us as Ishmael was. So it really doesn't matter which son was going to be sacrificed, but it really matters what it means to us. So I think it was a very huge trial, big test for, you wouldn't really imagine God asking somebody to sacrifice human beings, for we believe faith was actually, was brought to humankind to be righteous, to protect human nature, humankind, right? As a family, as individuals. And you're now seeing a God asking his prophet to sacrifice his son. So that was surely a trial, a test, as Rabbi and Bishop said. That's a part of the Islamic understanding too. And this is my subjective approach, though, that probably in the past and still do, many humans do sacrifice other human beings for the deities they worship. And probably what God was teaching us, how valuable the life of human beings were and still are, that he tested as one of his biggest, greatest prophets that he loved a lot with his own son. So teaching us the fact that we shouldn't be doing this way. So I think it's again another part of how submission helps us reveal the true wisdom of God so that we can straighten our human lives into a better, virtuous way of living.
Thank you. We're an hour into our session. We can go another hour or two, take a little break, and then continue for 3 hours after that. But we're not going to do that. We're going to turn this over to Dr. Petriano in a moment. I just want to make 2 announcements for our audience. One is, if you have questions, you can enter them through chat, and they will end up being emailed to me, and I'll read them. And the second announcement is, if this is your first meeting, the first time you've attended an Abraham's Table meeting, we would appreciate if you put your email into the chat box, just say first timer or anything of that sort, and we'd like to add you to our distribution list for future meetings. Dr. Petriano, I assume you've gotten some ammunition and thoughts from everybody, as well as your own. Your course may be a semester-long course on the Abrahamic religions, and we're going to ask you to boil it all down in the next 15 minutes.
Well, thank you, Steve, and hello, everyone out there. This has been a tremendously rich discussion, and I think just such a terrific model of true dialogue. I don't know about everyone else, but watching television these days, you can kind of get fatigued from the way people don't talk to each other and don't listen to each other. And I think we've just modeled something really wonderful by what we have all shared together. And I think that that comes very much out of the spirit of Abraham. I think all of us here, very obviously to me, as I'm listening, have appropriated into our own kind of understanding of ourselves and our faith the example of Abraham. And I think that's part of what has made us capable of having such a really fine conversation here this afternoon that's so enriching for all of us. Abraham is just this kind of iconic central figure. And as we've heard from all the participants today, there are so many different things we can say about Abraham, so many ways in which we can look to him as a sort of model for our own lives, and I think really for our own times. And I think in terms of Abraham being a model for our own times, and as we find ourselves living in a time when people are more and more closing themselves off in groups, tribalism is the word that is used a lot to characterize what we're experiencing today in so many ways. Abraham represents to us kind of the openness of God and of God's very life, and what God wants Abraham kind of represents. I was interested in preparing, for today's session to discover, one of the titles of Abraham that's found consistently in the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament and in the Holy Quran is the friend of God. So I would like to say a word or two about Abraham and friendship. First of all, because Abraham is described as a friend of God. If I can just share with you the texts here. In Surah 4 of the Quran, verse 125, who can be better in religion than one who submits his whole self to Allah? That's what we've heard about submission, right? One who submits his whole self to Allah, does good, and follows the way of Abraham, the true faith. For Allah did take Abraham for a friend. And so I think one of the terms we find from the Quran, and I know, please help me, Hakan, with the pronunciation, al-Khalil, which is that the Arabic word?
Halil.
Halil.
Right.
Halil, the friend of God. Then we find in the second book of Chronicles of the Hebrew Scriptures, are you not our God who drove out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and gave it to the descendants of Abraham, your friend forever? What a lovely expression of description of Abraham as God's friend forever, despite, as we've talked about, as the bishop reminded us, Abraham's own flaws, but from the perspective of God, friend forever. And then in the New Testament, the letter of James, chapter 2, verse 23, and the scripture was fulfilled, which says, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. So in the scriptures of all three of our traditions, we have very consistently this understanding of Abraham as a friend of God. And I'd like to extend that a little bit and say, because Abraham was a friend of God, he learned, what friendship means, and so another of the beautiful Abraham stories that I'd like to share, if maybe I could share with you one of my favorite Abraham stories. Okay, it's the story of Abraham. I guess the text I use says the terebinth of Mamre. He was outside of his tent by the oak tree when he was visited by three strangers who he comes to realize, at least in the book of Genesis, help me out with this, I think, Rabbi, but the three strangers he comes to understand as God speaking to him through the three strangers. But what I find so interesting is they were strangers to him at first, and yet he welcomes them into his tent. And so we find the tent of Abraham as being a very large tent. And I think our gathering here today, as representatives of different faiths, and those of you out there listening to us are part of this large tent. Abraham invites them into the tent, and they share a meal. I think that might be where this table of Abraham, the whole title that we've given to these dialogues may come from, the sharing of the meal. I wonder what it could have been. I don't know if it would have been like falafel and tea, or I don't know, whatever. It was that Middle Eastern hospitality that he offered to them. Yes.
It was milk and meat together.
Milk and meat together, really?
Because it was before the law and
Is
everything.
that right? Wow, that even makes it more interesting. Wow. See, and he shares that with them. Even that's terrific. Without being sure who they were. And there's a phrase that's not in the scripture, but it's sometimes used, that I've heard used to describe that moment as entertaining angels, right? And many times the strangers among us are angels in disguise. That's what I love about that story. And we must be careful how we treat those who are other and different, because we may just be entertaining angels. And I'm fascinated by that story. And if I could just take that a little bit further in terms of what we're doing here today as people of different faiths coming together, the image behind me, okay, I'm not in the city of Hebron through one of the wonders of virtual backgrounds. That is the cave of Machpelah in the city of Hebron. If I understand, again, please help me with the Hebrew here. I understand that Hebron comes from a Hebrew word for friend, and for Muslims, it's known as El Khalil, again, friend, okay? And it is the place of burial for Abraham and Sarah. It's the place of burial for Isaac and Rachel. For Rachel's not there?
No, Leah's
Leah, I'm sorry, Leah, yes, and Leah. And it's this holy site. Am I correct in saying for Jewish people, after the Temple Mount itself, like one of the most holy places to visit? And I think for Muslims too, I know it's considered a very holy place. I think I read that, help me out, this account. I think there's a tradition that says when the Prophet Muhammad was having his vision of ascent to God, he stopped at Hebron on the way, because this was like the holy place of the burial of Abraham and Sarah and some of the great patriarchs. And what I find so interesting about this is in Genesis chapter 25, for all the apparent rivalry that existed between Ishmael and Isaac and Hagar and Sarah, when Abraham dies, if I could just read, it's just such a short text, but to me it's so beautiful. At the end of chapter 25, well, no, it's in the middle of chapter 25, verse 7. The whole span of Abraham's life was 175 years. Then he breathed his last, dying at a ripe old age, grown old after a full life, and he was taken to his kinsmen. And here's the line. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, which faces Mamre. I just try to imagine, what this scene would have been like, that the two brothers who apparently, had been apart and experienced, like we talked about earlier, well, who's the favorite? This goes on in families all the time, I guess, right? And so who's the favorite son? I'm the favorite, you're the favorite, and part of the rivalry, but in grief, they come together. And I just find that a powerful image of coming together, of friendship, of dialogue, of what we're about here in this terrific conversation we've had together. I like, Rabbi, what you said about, I guess, did you use the word integration, or how Abraham, self-realization, how he kind of grew as an awareness of who he was. There's this inner growth going on in Abraham. But I loved as how you explained that. And what I saw there is something that's so important to me about the story of Abraham going forth. He didn't know where he was going. He had no idea where he was going, but he went. And there had to be tremendous uncertainty And I don't think it would be too much to read fearfulness into him stepping forth into the unknown. And I just find for that reason, we can only realize new possibilities and new potentialities in our lives. We can only grow when we're willing to take that step into the unknown and overcome fear with faith. That's what I think I heard everyone talking about in one way or another, Abraham's faith. And it's faith that enables us to overcome fear with trust and step out into the unknown. And I think, again, as we find ourselves in the year 2020, a year that everyone wants to forget, but everybody's going to remember, the ability to embrace the unknown with trust is one of the great legacies of Abraham that I kind of picked up in different ways from each of your really wonderful presentations. So I thank you for that. Steve, I had a song. I don't know if I could play it either now or at the end of the questions. Maybe it might be better at the end, or what do you think?
I would play it now.
Play it now, okay.
And I'll encourage the audience to submit questions.
Okay, bear with me, folks. Every time I try to share screen on Zoom, I always cross my fingers. So give me a moment here. The song is by a vocalist, John McCutcheon, and it's called Children of Abraham.
But Trevor's going to sing it if it doesn't work out.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
I only sing for the children.
Okay, perhaps here we go, maybe? Yes?
Yeah.
Great.
No fish.
Okay.
We just have to deal with the ads for a moment. I apologize.
We go.
And once again, we gather here as the night grows long, deep in the year. It is a season of light, of prayer and fasting, and the endless longing for love everlasting. All the children of Abraham, all the children of Abraham. And we are Isaac on the mountaintop. By the hand of God, may the killing stop. Faith without measure, hope without end. But it is love will make the nations bend. All the children of Abraham, all the children of Abraham, all the children of Abraham, all the children of Abraham. And he said there is but one, and he said there is but one. His name is Allah, his name is Yahweh, his name is Jesus, his name is God. All the children of Abraham. This dark December, as we look onward, let us remember we share this history, we share this place, we share this moment. We ask for grace, all the children of Abraham, all the children of Abraham, all the children of Abraham, all the children of Abraham. There is but one, and he said we are but one, and we know we are but one, and we are Muslims, we are Jews, we are Christian, we are just me and you, all the children of Abraham, 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 all the children of Abraham.
Awesome. Absolutely awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Right? Good.
Beautiful. Thank you. All the children.
Dr. Petriano, thank you for
Sure.
your summation and your comments and the perspective, and also for giving the Abraham's Table organization a new theme song, because
No, right.
this song is not
Absolutely.
just about Abraham, but it's about, you know, all of us and the big tent that you were speaking of. So I think that closes the more formal part of our panel presentations. Here are some of the other questions that have come in. So who are some other highly regarded figures in your faith, and how do they compare to Abraham in importance? I had prepared a question along these lines, had we had time for it, and I'll phrase it my way as well, but answer it any way you like. If we gave Muhammad 100 points in Islam as the dominant person in Quran, and we gave 100 points to Jesus as the dominant person in Christian scripture, and 100 points to Moses, so I think most would agree is the dominant personality and person in Jewish scripture. How many points would Abraham get relative to them? So those are two different ways that you might want to address the question. Hey, Khan, you mentioned earlier the prophets beginning with Adam, but maybe you could talk about that now in this context.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Holy Quran says there is no community for which God never sent any prophet. So every community in human history has received in some way a message from God so that they could be guided. And that started with Adam, actually. But Abraham is, as I said before, among the top 5. They're considered as ulul azm prophets. That's an Arabic definition, which means masters of determination, ulul azm. So Abraham was one of those, in addition to Moses, Jesus, Noah, and of course Muhammad. But I mean, as opposed to what you said about the Holy Quran, doesn't mention too much. Muhammad's name is not mentioned there too many times, but Moses' name is actually mentioned so many times. His story occupies the longest in the Quran, and Abraham probably comes second. But otherwise, it's in a tradition. It is called. It's either 124,000 or 224,000 prophets have been sent. And the Quran says, we have mentioned only some of their names to you, but there were others whose names we have not told you. So Abraham was among that top 5.
Thank you. Bishop Eggensteiner, would you comment on this?
Sure. As I was thinking about that question, Steve, he's very prominent. Abraham's name comes up in the New Testament 66 times. That's a lot. It's very predominant. And so I was thinking, at least for our faith, he's a really important figure, obviously. And that's that's for two reasons. I think one is this understanding of the covenant that God made with Abraham is still in effect, right? I'll bring up a dangerous word here in this context, that the covenant that God made with Abraham has not been superseded, right? It has not been superseded. Let me be clear about that, right? So that covenant is still in effect. And some of the stories that Abraham appears in the New Testament that I really love that show his importance is this clear indication that Abraham is still alive. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jesus says God is the God of the living. So if God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then they must be alive. And we do have this example in Luke's gospel where the story of Lazarus, who's a poor man who dies. And when he dies, he goes up to heaven and rests in the arms of Abraham, or as the spiritual would have it, in the bosom of Abraham, right on. He's just resting on Abraham's chest. And, rock of my soul, that's where he is, because that's a place of peace, of joy, of fulfillment. So imagine how critical our understanding of Abraham is, that he gets to be the one that brings us comfort and solace after we lived the life that we have lived. So he's a really, really critical figure in our understanding of the faith for many reasons. But just love that image of just resting in the arms of Abraham is our heavenly reward.
Rabbi Galaboy, who are some of the others in the Jewish pantheon, if I can mix metaphors there?
Jewish pantheon, that works. It's funny. It's to focus on Abraham first. He's, and this was one of the topics that was also thrown around. What happens to Judaism if Judaism, in Christian terms, so is the Old Testament? What happens with the new? And, the answer is, like, we kind of branched off almost. And there's that 2,000 years of rabbinical tradition, the teachings, the, expounding the expansion of the laws as well. And so Abraham plays this place, which is like between the prehistory and the history of the people, right? So if you were one who were to question or try to study from a literary or historical perspective the origins of the Bible, the Hebrew scripture, you might see that there are parallels in a lot of these stories with other cultures from that time, right? Other really mythologies. So Abraham is the start of something that we might be able to kind of almost reconcile historically, and he's the start of that particularism. But I'm a fan of psychology too. I kind of make a parallel to Freud. If Freud had not done his earth-shattering stuff, there's a reason why he's the father of psychiatry. But if we'd stopped at Freud, we'd be in trouble. If we stopped at Abraham, we'd be in trouble in the sense that we would not have grown and expanded and developed. And so Abraham gets that credit of being the first and setting the scene and setting some precedents about justice and family. So he's so important that way. But each generation, or throughout the generations, we've had more and more. So like Moses, yes, Moses is, I didn't count the number of times he appears, but definitely I'm feeling pretty confident that Moses's name appears more than anyone else's in the 5 books of Moses. The reason why they call it that. But we were not stopping at Moses either. We just keep developing. And so there are these historical pieces, these people who all have a place in how we got to today. So there are some amazing people. One is there's just, and there are the duels. There are a lot of duos of rabbis who debated in the rabbinical text, post Hebrew scripture. And, is Rabbi Hillel. Rabbi Shammai thought someone wasn't serious when someone came up and said, "Convert me while I stand on one foot." Al regel echad is how we say, just summarize it quickly. And Hillel chased him out of his shul, his house of study. And then he went to Rabbi Hillel. And so Shammai chases him out. Hillel, who's like the counterpart, the yin to the yang in that generation, Hillel says, what is hateful to others, what is hateful to you, do not do to others. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. So the idea is that there's so much that we build on, but we start with Abraham. So that's his place. And as far as who my favorite people are, it could be biblical, it could be, feminist, and it goes further and further beyond, because some of mine are some of the great legal thinkers of the Middle Ages and stuff like that. So it's a very, very rich tradition, as I would assume and know of others as well.
I have another question from the audience.
Steve, before we move to the next question, I could show a few things. It will take just a few seconds. Actually, if I can do it by sharing screen, this will reinforce what Professor Patriana was speaking about. For Abraham doesn't only mean something religiously, but it's a part of a very strong part of our Muslim culture too. So these are some of the Halil Ibrahim names used in restaurants in Turkey to show, to represent the generosity of the table Abraham shared with others.
Wow.
So he's a part of the Muslim culture with his name very strongly. And I know a friend who was traveling in southeast of Turkey 20-something years ago, and he was lost. He was going to ask his direction to the kids in the street. So there were 10 kids playing soccer, and he approached them to ask for the address, and then later he asked their names. So 9 out of 10 kids either were named Halil or Ibrahim. So all the boys, they were named either Halil or Ibrahim. So again, Abraham holds a very important place in the Islamic tradition. Among the 5 pillars of Islam is to go on Hajj, if you can afford it, to the holy city of Mecca, which we believe was built by him and his son Ismail. So this is the semicircle just next to the Holy Kaaba, which we believe under which Ismail and Hagar are buried. So it's a part of the 5 pillars of the Islamic tradition, where people go, millions go for pilgrimage every year. I mean, just to reinforce Professor Patriano's understanding of Abraham's generosity.
Khan, and the first picture you showed with the restaurants, the center image was the tent. So all the others were restaurant storefronts with their neon signs. But the first picture, which looked like a classical painting or some kind.
It is, I believe, a painting that shows the Sultan of the Ottomans with his committee, I believe. But obviously, Abraham was traveling as he was with his wife Sarah when he had hosted the angels. So he probably didn't have much to offer other than his animals, right? But still, even under those conditions, he did not refrain from any sort of from his generosity.
We have a few more questions. I haven't hesitated to call on one of you to be the first to respond, but to this question, I'm looking for a volunteer. God could have fulfilled Abraham's destiny anywhere. What is the value of the journey?
Well, I mean, I could go first with this one. There's a very important concept in the Islamic tradition, which is hijrah. Hijrah means to immigrate. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was forced to emigrate. He was thrown out by his own people. But Muslims actually started the Islamic calendar not when he received the first revelation, not when he first met the angel, but when he actually emigrated. That's when the true civilization, in our understanding, started. For the city of Yathrib, which was like 400 kilometers north of Mecca, was then a place which was basically suffering from diseases and illnesses. And with the Prophet and the system that he brought of a contract, he established this new civilization and changed the name of the city to Medina. Medina actually means civilization. So true human civilization starts when you move, when you are not settled and stuck in one place. And so I think that's a very crucial symbolism of Abraham's role that teaches us that we shouldn't really be stuck in one place and move along and learn about the world and bring with us whatever good we have.
Steve, if I could just jump in there, that and just develop that a little bit more from the perspective in Genesis. I think pointing to Machpelah, which isn't really behind me, but looks like it's behind me. I think there's a text where when Sarah died, he went to purchase the land there, and right, maybe Rabbi, you can help me with this. There was some question of whether he could purchase the land because he's a sojourner, I think is one of the English translations, and sojourner is just that idea of journey. Abraham as the sojourner, as the person on a journey. And if we're talking about him today as a model for all of us in our three faiths, it becomes true then that we are all sojourners, that we are all on a journey, we are all on a pilgrimage, the pilgrimage of life, the pilgrimage of faith. And he, through his faith and his submission, teaches us, how to make our way on that journey. I love that. I love that image. Yeah.
Sheila?
I just help clarify. Yes, I mean, I don't remember the Hebrew wording off the top of my head, but basically one of the things was that they wanted to, Abraham was by that time very well respected. And so the people there in Hebron wanted to gift him the cave, but he didn't want there to be any confusion or any question. And honestly, he could afford it, so he purchased it. And that was part of it, as well as doing the upright thing, is not, of giving it its worth too. He wanted to make sure that he gave its worth. And so that is one of the things too. And the journey part, the problem, not the problem, but 6 of our 7 matriarchs and patriarchs are buried in Machpelah, and it's Rachel who wasn't, because she died on a journey, on part of the journey, and so she was buried at the side of the road, so to speak, and but it said that Jacob put a pillar on her grave to mark it as well, and now that's a holy place where women who are barren actually go to pray. But it's this idea of journey. Now, I just want to clarify, when I said before that Abraham didn't know where he was going, but he was willing to go, God sent him towards Canaan. I mean, we know where he was headed, but it was a more big picture. What was the journey going to look like, and where was he going to end up? But part of it is the journey. I think part of it is removing yourself from everything familiar. We can get very comfortable in our lives, in our comfort zones, in our homes, in our families. So again, when Abraham is told to go from his father's house, it didn't just mean like, you're out of your 20s, it's time to start paying rent. But it meant that you can't stay in this comfort place, right? You're never going to really make your name in a place where, things are so comfortable, and you can fall into those routines and fall into other people's patterns. So I think part of it is the journey is metaphorical, but it's also literal, in that you have to journey, you have to move to that place of discomfort to be able to find the comfort, or the new normal, as we like to say, even in this age. We are on somewhat of a journey towards whatever our new normal might be, but we might not have taken a lot of the things that we've taken on in this pandemic time, commuting from home, or new jobs, or we wouldn't have taken it on if we were just so comfortable and could stay where we were comfortably. But when we can't stay where we are, when we're challenged to move forward and have to change our ways and accommodate, that's when we find growth.
One of the aspects of the journey too, I think, is not only what it says about Abraham, but what it says about God. and the developing understanding of monotheism. The reading in some churches this morning was from the prophet Isaiah, where Isaiah is talking about Cyrus, and the statement in there is clear that God says, I'm the only God there is no other, which means wherever you are, God is the God of that place too. So God crosses borders, right? God goes to Haran and says to Abraham, Abraham, I'm here, and we're going to go over here, and I'm going to go with you. So I'm not the localized God of this family or this place or this nation, but I am the only God there is. So wherever you go, I can be with you because I'm not space limited. And I think one of the important messages of this journey is that God is able to cross borders, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about too, part of the subtext of our conversation today. God's not just my God. He's not just the God of Rabbi Goluboy or of Mr. Yesilova, but we recognize that this God is the same God who is the only God in our understanding, in our monotheistic understanding, right, who is everywhere at the same time. So not localized to Haran or Canaan, but able to go with Abraham. Even when he's in Egypt, God is talking to Abraham, despite the fact that there are other gods resident there in the Egyptian understanding. God's like, yeah, okay, but I'm the only game in town, and the whole town's mine.
This next question from the audience builds on the discussion we've just had about sojourning and journey. What lessons do we learn about immigrants and being alien from Abraham? Your light lit up, Bishop, on my screen, so it looked like.
That's because I went,
Okay, well, that was enough to make you burst.
I'll take a brief crack at it and then depend on my colleagues to bail me out here. One of the things that maybe, not to put too strong a point on it, sets Christianity apart is lack of attachment to place. Even though we, have certain locations that are very holy to us, certainly that's true in Israel, there's not as much of an attachment. And that's neither good nor bad. I think that's just the reality. But it reflects this universality of God, right? So what's the historical narrative? A wandering Aramaean was my father, which, important for us to remember, is the aspects of the covenant and relationships that God established with Israel, we as Christians understand are also part of our inheritance. So a wandering Aramaean as a Christian was my father too. And you can look at that from both points of view, that Abraham was vulnerable. We've talked about that on places in that journey. And God provided for him, as did on occasion other people. But then also his ability to show hospitality to strangers, to sojourners. One of the places that in the New Testament that refers to Abraham is in the letter to the Hebrews, or what we're thinking now is probably a sermon, in which, let me find that reference. By faith, so the author of Hebrews is putting the emphasis on faith, and the author writes, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out to a place that he should receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing where he went. That some immigrants leave because of what's pushing them out, not where they're going. And by faith, they take that journey. And that tells us that God is present in those immigrants' lives. And we have the opportunity to provide hospitality and recognize them as our siblings. So I'll let the rest of you fill that picture out a little more or go a different direction.
No, I couldn't agree more. That's just such an important point that we can lose sight of. If we are truly children of Abraham and see him as a sojourner, and I think it has to affect at least our attitudes toward immigrants, toward migrants, toward refugees. It doesn't and it doesn't create a policy for us. I mean, that's really a hard issue, I guess, for countries. But however we form our policies, which are the thorny issues there, it has to be with a certain compassion and sympathy and understanding of these biblical texts and who we are as inheritors of as children of Abraham. I just think that's so important and so easy to lose sight of, and it's a tough issue today, because it's such a controversial issue, and I guess not only our own country, but in Europe and other parts of the world where there are so many refugees, because of, and it's going to, I think the situation is going to increase with, you have what they're calling climate refugees. There's going to be more and more people seeking, refuge, and how we treat them is a really important question. And I think for us as people of faith, from my perspective, we have to keep in mind with how you just explained it, Bishop Paul. It's just so important.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'd add that, we're pretty much all immigrants.
Yeah.
We consider ourselves like, First Nation, what we used to call Native Americans, and before that Indians, which was very wrong, misplaced. We are all immigrants. Most of the people here living in the United States are immigrants. We came here, like you said, because we had a reason to leave. Probably more so historically, I guess, definitely more so historically than that, because we had a place to come to. We used to talk about the Golden Medina, right? The streets paved with gold. It's not really true, but so we're all immigrants, and we should have some understanding of that. But again, when we look back to the lesson of Abraham, which doesn't quite have legal standing here, we know that, again, when he purchased the cave of Machpelah, his reputation preceded him in a positive way. They would have just gifted it to him, but he wanted to have a stake in what was his, and a stake in, you could say, the community. He was establishing himself as part of that community, at least as someone who was passing through or going to be there for some time. And, the Jewish people have been in exile for forever, pretty much, if you think about it. Before and after, I mean, most of the Jewish population has always lived outside of Israel, at least in modern times. So, we were never citizens until the French Sanhedrin in the late 1700s. I think it's 1792. So we always were that immigrant, that, the person who was dwelling in someone else's land, and our law even developed around it. So the way it developed was, we're taught, Dina de Malchuta Dina, that we have to respect the law of the land as well. And this isn't some modern, that didn't come out right, like it's a modern lesson or something to our current day. But the idea is that we have provisions, it's been discussed about from biblical times forward about what it means to be that immigrant. So the laws in the people who accepted the 10 Commandments, we're talking about Moses at Sinai, is also the Ger Toshav, the stranger who dwelled in your midst, right? So in every generation, we've had that stranger who dwells in our midst. We've had the people who are foreign to that current place. I mean, certainly have great lessons of people who have made those places, their homes, and brought great change and wealth and community to them. So when we talk about immigration, we shouldn't single out any population today as being, the immigrants or the immigration issue. And at the same time, there should be ways to welcome them through this great migration. And not to say whether your person, your body is legal or illegal, but that you are a person who, for whatever reason, is moving between one country and another, and artificial borders, especially when you talk about climate migration and stuff like that. And so how do we make this system work in a more computerized and formal environment, but not treat it as some new and unusual and unnatural historical, blip or something like that. This is the way the world is, and the way the world as we know it has always been.
Well, I could say a few words too, if we have time. Steve, you probably have other questions too.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
But I mean, we know, I think the Holy Quran basically praises those who emigrate. Ellezina amenu ve hajeru ve jahedu. Just after having the faith, those who immigrate, those who move, this even comes before one strives for his faith. That the first step after having the faith is to move, to emigrate to a place. So it's a part of the human civilization, and even Arnold Toynbee says that almost all the great civilizations of human history were actually established by those who emigrated. I think it's a big opportunity to cross-fertilize and learn, but also we need to realize the fact that those who have already come first, it's not an easy time for them either. As probably I'm the newest comer to the States, so I've learned a lot from my fellow American friends and neighbors, but I can also sympathize with the fact that this is not easy. It was not easy for me, but it was not easy for the host people too. So I know it from my home country in Turkey, when millions of Syrians had to move up to north to Turkey, and now have started becoming more settled, not in one place or camps, but now in the heart of Istanbul, Ankara, or Izmir. That's a big challenge for Turks. So it's not an easy thing, but I think that the religious communities, as we have the greatest sources of knowledge based on our holy books and the teachings of our prophets, I think we have a huge instrument and tool and capacity to perhaps guide our governments so that this transition becomes easy and more beneficial for both parties, the newcomers and those who are hosting them. So I think this event like this one and the communities that support such events have the greatest power to really navigate our path forward.
I think we have time for one more question. I would like to get each panelist to give his perspective about when Abraham had the knife raised to kill his son. God had to tell him or call him twice to not do it. I think the words in the text say, Abraham, Abraham. Any takers on that?
Well, that's not how it is in the Holy Quran, so I would leave it to my fellow participants here to answer that.
While others are thinking, I'll mention that in the text in the Hebrew scriptures, after the sacrifice of the ram, Abraham departs back down the mountain to his men who had helped with the journey there, and that's very specific. Abraham goes down the hill. Isaac does not go down, is not mentioned as going down the hill. And the legend, so to speak, or a commentary, which it doesn't have, it's not a matter of faith, it's a matter of interpretation, is that Isaac was actually wounded, that Abraham was not quite able to stop himself, and Isaac was wounded and went for medical attention, so to speak, to heal. So Rabbi, I'm poaching on your territory. I apologize.
It's okay. There's another interpretation, which, from, again, I love the psychology of all of it. And the other interpretation is, yes, absolutely. It doesn't mention Isaac again in that passage. Abraham goes down and rejoins his men. And then Abraham goes back And Abraham goes back and presumably, and the next thing we know, Sarah dies. So there are some interesting pieces to it. First of all, Sarah's, I still follow that it was a test and that Isaac didn't die, but certainly Sarah is completely shocked and floored that any of this went on. Perhaps she even got wind of it while they were gone for the 3 days or more. But one of the other commentaries says that Isaac went off on his own, kind of like doing some soul searching, doing some recovery, a little bit of, we don't call it PTSD, we call it acute stress disorder. But, you've got to process this, because just because we know Abraham's faith is strong, of the 3 patriarchs, the person we know the least about in the text is Isaac. And as a matter of fact, there's a great article whose author I cannot recall at the moment, it might have been Judith Abrams, but about, was Isaac disabled? Because everything we know about Isaac, the fact that Abraham had to send his servant to find a wife for Isaac, and when she saw Isaac, she kind of like lowered her veil and almost fell off her camel. Even to the fact that if you do the math, it seems Isaac was 37 years old when he was nearly sacrificed, and one might think he might have had a little bit more, self-preserving instinct in him than to allow himself to get that close. So it's problematic, but the way we interpret it more is that this sets Isaac off on parental separation. There's again, almost like his own Lech Lecha, for better or for worse. Maybe it's the negative that pushed him forward. And then we do, of course, hear about them again together. But at that moment, there's a significant rift where almost you can say Abraham chose God over Isaac, or Isaac thinks Abraham chose God over his own son.
Bishop, do you want to get in on this?
Just briefly, I thank you, Rabbi. That's fascinating. And along the lines of some things I had heard that we know very little about Isaac. He seems to be traumatized as a young man. Ironic that his name is Laughter. It seems like the only laughter he gets is when he's playing with his older brother Ishmael. They seem to have a good relationship, right? But then at the end of his life, he gets tricked by his wife and younger son. So he doesn't have much of a personality of his own. So it's kind of a sad story that we have with this boy named Laughter. But I can certainly see the angel calling Abraham's name twice, because I don't for the moment believe that angels and divine beings have the same kind of emotions that we do. But I know that when I'm anxious, I'm going to repeat myself if I'm trying to get my wife's attention, like, babe, hold on. And I think there was an urgency. I think that repetition of Abraham's name reflects an urgency of like, okay, don't do this. It was a test. We told you that in verse 1, but I want to make it sure you got it here. Don't do this. So I think that heightens the urgency in the story to call his name twice.
Okay, I think we're done. Any final words from? Go ahead, Batsheva.
Unmute yourself.
There we go. Just to say that the portion of Lech Lecha, of go forth, is the third in the cycle of reading. We just started rereading the scriptures. As you know, we read the whole 5 books during the year, and this is the third portion. Next week, we'll be reading Lech Lecha. We're just in the midst of the story of Noah right now. So if you want to listen to any Torah readings, and if you can find them on Zoom or streaming from any of the synagogues, tune in to the reading and to some of the interpretations that you would get from the rabbis in the areas. So happy reading, going forth like Abraham. I did too. And let's go forward for health and peace and more understanding among all of us.
Amen to that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Steve, as well, for moderating.
Well, I want to thank our audience. I want to thank each of you. This has been terrific. Mehmet, if you can hear me when we close the meeting for the audience, if you could leave the panel Zoom on for another couple of minutes so we can thank one another without doing it in front of the audience. I want to thank the audience for your attention. I want to thank you for the questions you provided for this last half hour or 45 minutes. I want to remind you to please put your emails into the chat if this is if you're not on the distribution list already. And with that, Mehmet, I think you could sign off the YouTube.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.